He did what? What do you mean he crossed the Rhine first? I gave specific orders. Get him on the line now. This is insubordination.
It is 10:48 p.m. on March 22nd, 1945. A German machine gun crew dozes beside cold coffee on the eastern bank of the Rhine River near the wine town of Oppenheim. Without warning, the night erupts. Tracer rounds rip across the black water shells, crash into the vineyards, and a wall of orange fire briefly turns the river into daylight. Men scream. Boats splinter. And somewhere in that chaos, an American combat engineer flattens himself against cold mud as shrapnel screams over his head, praying the bridge he has spent 6 hours building does not become his grave. This is the night nobody in Berlin saw coming. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next gripping video. Join us as we uncover more incredible stories, real historical events, and inspiring moments from the past. Join our community of history lovers and never miss an episode. His name barely appears in any official record. He was 22 years old, a combat engineer from a small town in Ohio, the kind of soldier history books never bother to name. Before the war, he had welded grain silos and fixed tractor engines for farmers who could not afford a mechanic. Now he was crouched in mud on the western bank of the most feared river in Europe, holding a pontoon section that would, in a matter of hours, become part of one of the boldest gambles of the entire Second World War. Within 36 hours, that gamble would put 6 full American battalions on the eastern bank of Hitler's last Great Barrier, cost barely 3 dozen casualties, and humiliate the most famous general in the British Army before he had even fired his first shell. To understand how an anonymous welder turned combat engineer ended up at the center of one of the war's defining nights, you have to go back to what the Rhine actually meant and why crossing it was supposed to be impossible without months of preparation. By the winter of 1945, Allied armies had fought their way from the beaches of Normandy through 8 brutal months of hedgerows, forests, and frozen fields to reach Germany's doorstep. The cost had been staggering. Entire divisions had been chewed apart in the Hurtgen forest. Thousands had frozen to death or been cut down during the Battle of the Bulge. And now, after all of that bleeding, the Allies faced one final obstacle standing between them and the heart of the Reich: the Rhine itself. 820 miles of cold water that had defended German soil since the days of the Roman legions. German High Command had spent months preparing for this exact moment. Every bridge across the river had already been destroyed. Artillery batteries sat positioned in the hills overlooking the most obvious crossing points. War planners had drawn up detailed defensive scenarios for an Allied assault near the major cities where road and rail bridges had once stood. Doctrine on both sides agreed on one point: crossing a heavily defended river of this size required weeks of preparation, overwhelming firepower, total air superiority, and a methodical, rehearsed assault. Nobody crossed the Rhine quickly. Nobody crossed it quietly. It simply was not done. That assumption was about to be shattered, and not by the general everyone expected. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, commander of the British 21st Army Group, had been assembling the largest river crossing operation of the entire war. Over 1 million men. Roughly 4,000 artillery pieces. Landing craft hauled overland from the English Channel. A massive smokescreen running for days to blind German reconnaissance. His crossing, codenamed Operation Plunder, was scheduled for the night of March 23rd, and it was meant to be the single decisive blow that finally cracked Germany open. It was meticulous, it was overwhelming. And it was about to be beaten to the river by a man nobody had given the green light to go first. 300 miles to the south sat Lieutenant General George Patton, commander of the United States Third Army. A man who had clawed his way back from career disaster after striking a hospitalized soldier in Sicily, who had pivoted an entire army 90 degrees in the dead of winter to save trapped paratroopers at Bastogne, and who had quietly been told that his role in the coming Rhine offensive would be secondary. He would cross only after Montgomery's main effort in the north had already begun. Patton had no intention of waiting his turn, and his engineers had already begun searching for a way around that order in the form of a stretch of riverbank nobody in Berlin was even watching. This is where our young engineer from Ohio comes back into the story, because the idea his unit was about to attempt was considered by nearly every standard of accepted military doctrine completely insane. The plan that Patton's staff settled on was this. Instead of striking at the obvious heavily fortified crossing points where every German gun in the sector was already aimed, they would cross at Oppenheim and the neighboring town of Nierstein, a quiet stretch of vineyards 12 miles south of Mainz, that barely registered on German defensive priority lists. There would be no 4-hour artillery bombardment, no airstrikes to soften the far bank, no weeks of staging. The crossing would happen in near total silence, using boats carried by hand instead of trucks, with soldiers under strict orders not to speak above a whisper, not to smoke, and not to fire a single round unless fired upon first. Bridging equipment, the very pontoon sections our engineer had spent weeks training to assemble, would be hidden inside ordinary supply convoys, tarped over and mixed in with crates of rations and ammunition, so that a German reconnaissance pilot flying overhead would see nothing but another routine logistics run. To the officers who first heard the plan, it sounded like suicide. Crossing a major defended river without artillery, preparation broke every rule taught at West Point. One senior commander reportedly protested that a properly planned and ordered crossing simply was not possible on such short notice. Patton's answer was essentially that he did not need it to be perfect. He needed it to be fast, and he needed it before Montgomery's guns lit up the sky 300 miles north and every German reserve in the region went on full alert. When pressed, the division commander tasked with leading the assault admitted he could get some troops across that very night. For Patton, that was enough. What nobody in that planning room fully grasped yet was that this reckless doctrine-breaking gamble was about to save more lives than it risked, and our anonymous engineer was going to be one of the men who made it work. On the afternoon of March 22nd, the order finally came down. The crossing would begin that night. Preparation for the operation was a study in controlled chaos and absolute secrecy. Boats meant for 40 men were carried, not driven across muddy fields toward the riverbank under cover of darkness. Engineers like our young Ohioan worked for hours staging pontoon sections along the bank. Every movement deliberate, every voice dropped to a whisper. There was no warm-up. There was no rehearsal. Men who had crossed the Moselle, the Saar, and the Sauer in previous months understood exactly what was at stake, because they had felt the specific terror of paddling into open water with no idea whether someone on the far shore was waiting with a machine gun. At 10 o'clock that night, the first boat slid into the Rhine. The current took the bows immediately, tugging the small craft downstream as paddlers fought to correct their angle. There was no engine noise, no covering fire, no artillery softening up the far bank. Just the quiet slap of paddles against black water and the muffled breathing of men who knew that the next few minutes could end everything. Our engineer waited on the western bank with his unit, listening for gunfire that would mean the assault had failed, for flares that would mean they had been spotted, for the screaming whistle of incoming shells that would mean the secret was already out. None of it came. The German defenders waiting on the far bank were not the battle-hardened veterans German doctrine assumed would be guarding the Rhine. They were Volkssturm, a desperate late-war militia of elderly men and factory workers, handed bolt-action rifles, and told to hold a position nobody believed would actually be attacked. Within 30 minutes, the lead boats of the United States Third Army were already halfway across Hitler's most sacred river, and the men defending the opposite shore had no idea the assault had even begun. By 2 a.m, an entire infantry regiment stood on the eastern bank. By 6 full battalions had crossed and were digging in, listening for a counterattack that simply never materialized. Total casualties for the initial assault came to roughly 34 killed, and wounded, an almost unbelievable number for 6 battalions crossing a major defended river at night. But getting infantry across in rubber boats was only half the problem, and it was the half that did not require our engineer's particular skills. The far more dangerous job belonged to him, and the hundreds of men like him in the combat engineer battalions, tasked with building a bridge strong enough to carry tanks in darkness, under threat of artillery and air attack, with German positions less than 400 yards away. Working in near total silence, hauling pontoon sections by hand, and locking them into place section by section across nearly 1,200 feet of moving river. Our young engineer and his battalion raced against the rising sun. Every minute of darkness was protection. Every minute of daylight was exposure. Scattered German artillery did eventually find the riverbank shells crashing into the vineyards and along the shoreline close enough to send men diving for cover, close enough to rattle the very bridge sections they were trying to lock together, but never quite landing the direct hit that would have ended everything. German aircraft appeared overhead at least once, only to be driven off by anti-aircraft batteries the Americans had quietly pre-positioned on the western bank before the operation even began. By the time the sun rose on March 23rd, the impossible had happened. A pontoon bridge spanned the Rhine. American tanks began rolling across it onto German soil less than 24 hours after the first silent boat had touched the eastern bank, and roughly 36 hours before Montgomery's massive, meticulously planned assault was scheduled to even begin. Word reached Bradley first in a phone call that has since become one of the most quoted exchanges of the entire campaign. Patton, in a voice deliberately low and almost conspiratorial, told his commanding officers simply that he was across, that he had slipped a division over the previous night, and that there were so few Germans in the area they did not even realize it had happened yet. From there, the news began climbing the chain of command toward Supreme Headquarters, toward a Supreme Commander who had no idea until that very morning that his most unpredictable general had just rewritten the rules of how this war was supposed to end. For our anonymous engineer from Ohio, none of that mattered yet. He was soaked exhausted and still alive standing on a riverbank in Germany. That 12 hours earlier, every rule of military doctrine said should have been impossible to reach this quickly. He had no idea that the bridge he had just helped build in 18 hours under enemy fire would later be called one of the most remarkable engineering achievements of the entire European campaign. He had no idea that 300 miles north, an army 1,000,000 men strong was about to launch the largest planned river assault in modern history, only to discover that someone had already beaten them to the far shore. He certainly had no idea what Eisenhower was about to say when he found out, because the silent crossing at Oppenheim was only the opening move. What came next would expose a stunning rivalry between two of the most famous generals of the war force, a supreme commander into one of the most delicate diplomatic balancing acts of his career, and trigger a sequence of events that would help bring the entire war in Europe to its knees in less than 7 weeks. In Part 2, we go inside the phone call that left Eisenhower stunned. The very different river crossing Montgomery was about to launch with overwhelming force and devastating cost, and the reason history still argues over who actually won the race across the Rhine. It is 6:14 a.m. on March 23, 1945. Our young engineer from Ohio is still on the eastern bank of the Rhine, soaked to the bone, when the first German shell screams in low over the vineyards and detonates close enough to throw mud across his uniform. The bridge behind him is finished. Tanks are already rolling across it. But 6 battalions of American soldiers are standing on Hitler's sacred soil with almost nothing behind them. And somewhere out there in the German lines, officers are scrambling to find anything with a gun barrel that can reach the river before it is too late. The crossing had worked. That part of the gamble had already paid off. But a bridgehead with no depth, no reserves, and an enemy who has not yet realized how weak the defense actually is, can collapse in a single afternoon. The real test of whether Patton's audacious doctrine-breaking plan would hold was only just beginning, and it was about to collide with something far more dangerous than German artillery, the politics of an alliance that could not afford to admit what had just happened. Word of the crossing reached General Omar Bradley on the morning of March 23rd in a phone call that has become one of the most famous exchanges of the entire war. Patton's voice on the line was deliberately quiet, almost conspiratorial, the tone of a man who knew exactly how big a secret he was sitting on. He told Bradley he had slipped a division across the river overnight, that there were so few Germans in the sector they had not even noticed yet, and that for now nobody should make an announcement. Bradley's reported response was simple disbelief, a kind of stunned half-laugh dressed up as a question across the Rhine. Patton's answer was that yes, he was sure, and that he had crossed a division over the night before, without losing more than a handful of men. That conversation should have been a moment of pure celebration. Instead, it set off a chain reaction that would test Dwight Eisenhower's diplomatic skill almost as severely as it tested the soldiers holding the eastern bank. Here is the problem nobody outside the highest levels of Allied command fully understood at the time. Eisenhower was not simply running a war against Germany. He was running a coalition. And coalitions are fragile things held together by trust, ego management, and an enormous amount of unspoken compromise. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery commanded the British 21st Army Group. For 6 weeks, Montgomery had been assembling Operation Plunder, a river crossing, on a scale almost impossible to comprehend. More than 1 million men, roughly 4,000 artillery pieces, landing craft, physically hauled overland from the English Channel, a smokescreen that had been burning continuously since March 16th to blind German reconnaissance. Montgomery intended his crossing, scheduled for the night of March 23rd, to be remembered as the single decisive blow that finally broke Germany open. Churchill was personally invested in the prestige of that operation. The British public was watching, and now, less than 24 hours before Montgomery's guns were even scheduled to fire, an American general 300 miles to the south had quietly beaten him to the river, using a fraction of the men and almost none of the preparation. If Eisenhower stood up and publicly declared that Patton's improvised night crossing had achieved more with dramatically fewer casualties than Montgomery's million-man set-piece assault, the diplomatic fallout inside the alliance could have been severe. 2 years of carefully managed cooperation between American and British commanders, 2 years of smoothing over arguments about strategy, resources, and credit, could have unraveled over a single press statement. So, when Eisenhower received confirmation of what had happened at Oppenheim, multiple aides who were present that morning described him as outwardly composed, but clearly caught off guard, setting down a cigarette and picking it back up, processing not just the military reality, but the political minefield it had just opened beneath his feet. He wrote Patton a warm letter that same day, acknowledging the achievement. But publicly, his language stayed careful, measured, diplomatically neutral. He could praise the Third Army. He could not declare a winner in a race that officially was not supposed to be a race at all. Patton, of course, had other plans entirely. For the first several hours after the crossing, secrecy had been the whole point of the operation. The Germans in the Oppenheim sector still believed nothing unusual had happened. But once German reconnaissance finally spotted American armor rolling across the new pontoon bridge later that same day, secrecy stopped mattering. And the instant it stopped mattering, Patton called Bradley a second time with a completely different set of instructions. He told Bradley, in essence, to tell the world that the Third Army was across, and that he wanted everyone to know it happened before Montgomery had even begun. Bradley obliged. The press release went out that same day. By the time Montgomery's massive 4-hour artillery bombardment finally began thundering across the northern Rhine that night, American newspapers already had a story dated the previous evening, one that made the most ambitious river crossing of the war look in the eyes of the public like it was playing catch-up to a general nobody had even authorized to go first. This was the new battlefield Patton had opened, and it was not fought with tanks or artillery. It was fought with headlines. Meanwhile, on the German side of the river, an entirely different and far more immediate crisis was unfolding, and it would become the true test of whether the gamble at Oppenheim could actually survive. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring had been commander-in-chief of the Western Front for barely 11 days when reports reached him that American forces had somehow established a foothold on the eastern bank near Oppenheim, in a sector his own staff had barely bothered to defend. Kesselring had spent 18 months defending Italy against Allied invasions before being transferred west, and he understood immediately what an unchecked bridgehead could become if it was allowed to grow. He asked his staff a simple, urgent question: what could be sent to seal it off before the Americans dug in too deep to dislodge? The answer that came back was almost nothing. There were perhaps 60 tanks remaining from the shattered 11th Panzer Division, sitting roughly 30 miles away, with barely enough fuel and ammunition for 1 or 2 real engagements. There were 18 artillery pieces of mixed caliber with no unified fire control system to coordinate them effectively. There was no meaningful air support left to call on. The Luftwaffe that had once blackened the skies over Europe had been reduced to scattered remnants flying obsolete aircraft on whatever fuel could be scraped together. Standard military doctrine held that destroying a defended bridgehead required something close to 3-to-1 superiority in favor of the attacker. Kesselring had nowhere near that. The Americans, by contrast, already had 6 full battalions across the river and were reinforcing by the hour. He attacked anyway, because that is simply what an army does when there is nothing left to do but attack. What followed was the real climax of the entire operation, the moment that would determine whether Patton's audacious gamble had actually paid off, or whether it would collapse into a costly embarrassment. German armor began rolling toward the American positions on the eastern bank in the early hours after the crossing, the last serious mechanized force the Wehrmacht could muster in that entire sector of the front. American artillery, not the 18 scattered guns Kesselring had available, but well over 100 pieces from combined division and corps artillery, opened fire with full aerial observation, directing every round. P-47. Thunderbolt fighter bombers dove out of the sky onto the exposed German panzers, strafing and bombing columns that had no air cover of their own to answer with. Not a single German tank reached the bridge. The Luftwaffe made one more attempt to undo everything in a single stroke, sending roughly 15 fighters and fighter bombers in an effort to destroy the pontoon bridge from the air before it could be reinforced into something permanent. American anti-aircraft batteries, the same guns that had been quietly pre-positioned on the western bank before the crossing even began, drove the German planes back before they could line up an effective run. The bridge held. It did not so much as buckle. With the counterattack broken and the bridge still standing, Kesselring sent a message up the chain of command recommending withdrawal to prepared defensive positions further east, a retreat that might have stabilized the front and bought Germany precious time. Hitler's reply came back in 4 words: hold at all costs. There was almost nothing left to hold with. What happened over the following days was not really a battle in any traditional sense. It was a collapse. By March 26th, roughly 18,000 American soldiers had poured across at Oppenheim and Nierstein, the bridgehead expanding far faster than German command had any capacity to respond to. By late March, an entire American armored division was rolling east through what had days earlier been considered a quiet, unimportant stretch of riverbank. By March 28th, the bridgehead had grown 30 miles deep into German territory. Entire German units simply stopped functioning as coherent fighting forces. Command structures broke down. Soldiers surrendered in groups that would have been unthinkable just weeks earlier. This is where the institutional resistance our young engineer and his commanders had faced earlier in the story. The doubt from senior officers who insisted a proper crossing required weeks of preparation was finally completely answered. Not with an argument, with results. Patton's Third Army took Frankfurt on March 29th. They reached Nuremberg in early April. By the middle of April, American armor was operating deep inside Bavaria. The distance from the Rhine to the Austrian border territory that had once seemed like it would require months of grinding combat to cross fell in under 4 weeks. To understand how staggering that is, compare it to what it had taken to get to the river in the first place. 8 months. 8 months of fighting through the hedgerows of Normandy, through the Siegfried Line's concrete dragon's teeth and pillboxes, through the frozen hell of the Hürtgen forest, through the desperate winter battles of the Bulge, just to reach the western bank of the Rhine. And then 4 weeks, only 4, to cross it and tear the heart out of what remained of Nazi Germany's ability to resist. Germany would formally surrender on May 7, 1945, less than 7 weeks after a handful of silent boats slipped into the Rhine under the cover of darkness near a wine town nobody in Berlin had bothered to defend. And yet 300 miles to the north, an entirely different version of this same river was about to be crossed in an entirely different way by a man who still did not know, when his own preparations reached their final hours, that he had already lost the race he never agreed to enter. Operation Plunder launched on the night of March 23rd, just as scheduled, and by every conventional military measure, it succeeded brilliantly. Roughly 4,000 Allied artillery pieces opened fire in a bombardment that lasted 4 continuous hours, a wall of explosive force that shook the ground for miles in every direction. The crossings at Ries, at Wesel, and south along the Lippe River proceeded largely according to plan. The following day, March 24th, Operation Varsity dropped 14,000 paratroopers east of the Rhine in a single coordinated airborne assault, the largest operation of its kind in the entire war. German resistance in the north was significantly heavier than what the Americans had encountered at Oppenheim, including elements of the German 1st Parachute Army dug in and waiting. Montgomery's operation achieved everything it set out to achieve. It also cost 6,781 Allied casualties. On March 24th alone, 1,111 Allied soldiers were killed, the single worst day for Allied airborne troops in the entire war. And by the time Operation Plunder's guns had even finished their preparatory bombardment, Patton's engineers already had a working bridge across the Rhine. American armor was already rolling deep into German territory, and newspaper headlines back home were already written. The contrast between the two operations was not exaggerated for effect. It was simply real. One crossing had been built on overwhelming methodical force against a heavily defended sector, and it had worked at enormous human cost. The other had been built on speed secrecy and a willingness to accept tactical risk against a depleted, barely defended sector, and it had worked at almost no cost at all. Both achieved their strategic objective. Both helped bring the war in Europe to its knees within weeks of each other. But only one of them produced a story the press could not resist, and Patton understood that better than almost anyone in either army. When Montgomery finally learned that an American general had crossed the Rhine more than a day ahead of his own carefully orchestrated assault, his reaction was described by those close to him as contained, controlled, and absolutely furious underneath the surface. There is even a story recounted in Patton's own later writing that the British Broadcasting Corporation had prepared and aired a speech from Churchill congratulating Montgomery for achieving the first opposed Rhine crossing in modern military history. A broadcast that went out before anyone apparently checked whether the claim was still true. By the time it aired, Patton had already been across for roughly 36 hours. Whether every detail of that particular anecdote survived 80 years of retelling without embellishment is difficult to say with total certainty, but it captures something true about the moment, regardless. The war of headlines had already been decided before Montgomery's own operation had even finished. Montgomery, for his part, never fully let go of being upstaged. In his post-war memoirs, Operation Plunder received pages of detailed description. Oppenheim received a single dismissive sentence characterized as a crossing of only minor tactical significance. Military historians studying the campaign in the decades since have overwhelmingly disagreed with that assessment, pointing to exactly the kind of numbers laid out above: a fraction of the casualties, a fraction of the preparation time, and a strategic collapse of the entire German Central Front that followed within days. Back at Oppenheim, our young engineer from Ohio had no idea any of this political maneuvering was happening above his head. He was still digging in, still reinforcing a bridge that German artillery and aircraft had failed to destroy. Still watching American tanks and trucks pour across a structure he had helped build out of nothing in 18 hours under direct enemy fire. He did not know that a supreme commander was carefully managing what he could and could not say in public about what had just happened. He did not know that a field marshal 300 miles north was about to discover in the worst possible way that the war's most decisive crossing of the Rhine had already happened without him. All he knew was that the bridge had held, that the counterattack had failed, and that German soldiers were now surrendering in numbers nobody on the American side had expected just days earlier. What none of them could have predicted, not Patton, not Eisenhower, not Kesselring, desperately trying to hold a front that was already disintegrating beneath him, was just how completely the gamble at Oppenheim would reshape the final weeks of the war in Europe, or how personally and theatrically Patton intended to celebrate it once the dust settled enough for him to make the crossing himself. Because 2 days later, Patton was going to walk out onto that very bridge in front of his own staff stop in the middle of the Rhine River that had defended Germany for 2,000 years and do something so deliberately, defiantly undignified that it would become one of the most retold moments of the entire Second World War, immortalized in a photograph, a telegram, and a line that read, simply, "I have just pissed into the Rhine River. For God's sake, send some gasoline." That moment and the full collapse of the German Central Front that followed it is where Part 3 begins. Because as triumphant as the crossing at Oppenheim had been, the real question facing the Allied High Command was no longer whether they could get across the Rhine. It was how fast the entire German war machine could now be torn apart before Hitler's final orders to hold at all costs turned into something even more desperate, and how the rivalry between two of the most famous generals of the war was about to spill out of military reports and into the front pages of newspapers on both sides of the Atlantic. The Rhine had been crossed. The bridge at Oppenheim had survived shellfire air attack and a desperate counterattack from the last serviceable panzers Field Marshal Kesselring could scrape together. By March 28th, the American bridgehead stretched 30 miles into German territory, and our young engineer from Ohio, still attached to his battalion, was now watching something he had never expected to see this fast: an entire German army group beginning to come apart at the seams. This was no longer a controlled retreat. It was a collapse, and the German High Command was about to discover just how badly that collapse had been set in motion by a crossing they had never even bothered to plan for. German intelligence, what was left of it by late March 1945, had finally pieced together what happened. Reconnaissance reports confirmed that an entire American field army had crossed the Rhine at a sector defended by little more than elderly militia and a skeleton garrison, and that the bridge supporting that crossing had survived every attempt to destroy it. For commanders still operating under the assumption that the Rhine represented Germany's last defensible barrier, this was catastrophic information to receive. Emergency briefings were called at multiple levels of command in the days following the crossing, as officers tried to determine how a sector with so little strategic priority had become the single point where the entire Western Front had effectively been pried open. The numbers told the story better than any briefing could. In the 8 days following the Oppenheim crossing, German prisoner counts along the Central Front climbed into the tens of thousands, far exceeding anything German planners had projected for this stage of the campaign. Entire battalions that should have taken days to subdue were surrendering in hours. Communication between German divisional headquarters and their parent corps began breaking down as roads filled with retreating troops, refugees, and shattered supply columns, making it nearly impossible for Kesselring's staff to coordinate any kind of organized defense. What had been just 1 week earlier a coherent, if weakened, front line was rapidly becoming a patchwork of isolated pockets, each fighting on its own initiative with no realistic hope of reinforcement. Hitler's standing order remained unchanged: hold at all costs. But an order is only as strong as the men available to carry it out, and by the final days of March, German reserves in the central sector had effectively ceased to exist in any meaningful military sense. Some local commanders attempted to obey anyway, throwing scratch units, anti-aircraft crews repurposed as infantry, even Hitler Youth battalions, into hastily organized blocking positions. Most of these efforts achieved little beyond delaying American advances by a matter of hours. The mathematics that had doomed Kesselring's initial counterattack at the bridgehead, an attacker needing 3-to-1 superiority against a force that instead held nearly all the advantages, had only worsened with each passing day. But the chaos unfolding inside the German lines was not the only crisis developing that week, and our engineers' own side was about to discover a very different kind of problem, one that had nothing to do with enemy resistance and everything to do with the sheer speed of their own success. An advance this fast does not run on willpower, it runs on fuel, and by the final days of March, Patton's Third Army was consuming gasoline faster than supply lines stretching back to Normandy, and the Channel ports could realistically replace it. Tank columns that had been racing toward Frankfurt and beyond began reporting fuel reserves measured in hours rather than days. Trucks queued at supply depots that simply did not have enough to give them. This was the exact shortage behind the now famous telegram Patton had sent to Supreme Headquarters after crossing the bridge at Oppenheim, the request for gasoline tucked into an otherwise irreverent message, and it was not a joke buried inside a joke. It was a genuine, escalating operational crisis. An army that had just achieved one of the most audacious river crossings of the entire war was now in real danger of stalling out, not because the Germans had stopped it, but because its own logistics could not keep pace with its momentum. This created friction at the highest levels of command. Senior logistics officers argued that fuel allocated to Patton's rapid advance was being diverted from other sectors of the front that needed it just as badly, including Montgomery's own continuing operations in the north. Some officers privately questioned whether Patton's headlong push east was reckless overreach, an advance so fast it had outrun its own ability to sustain itself, exposing forward units to potential isolation if German resistance somehow stiffened before resupply caught up. For a few tense days, there were real conversations at Bradley's headquarters about whether Third Army needed to be ordered to pause and consolidate, a suggestion Patton resisted with the same stubborn intensity that had defined his entire career. To slow down now, he argued, would hand the Germans exactly the breathing room they desperately needed to reorganize a defense. The doubts did not entirely vanish. But the momentum and the results piling up daily made it increasingly difficult for anyone to argue convincingly that the gamble had gone too far. It was in the middle of this exact tension between a collapsing enemy and a logistics system straining to keep up that Third Army's advance produced one of the most significant and sobering moments of the entire campaign. On April 4, 1945, elements of the 4th Armored Division, part of Patton's Third Army, advanced into a wooded hillside near the German city of Gotha and discovered a forced labor camp known as Ohrdruf, a subcamp of the much larger Buchenwald complex. What American soldiers found there stopped the advance in its tracks in a way no German counterattack had managed to do. Roughly 3,200 bodies lay scattered across the campgrounds. Men who had been worked starved, and in the camp's final days, executed by retreating SS guards attempting to eliminate witnesses before fleeing east. Survivors who remained were in conditions soldiers who had fought through Normandy, the Bulge, and the Rhine crossing itself described as unlike anything they had encountered in nearly a year of continuous combat. Word of the discovery moved up the chain of command immediately. On April 12th, just over a week after the camp's liberation, Dwight Eisenhower personally traveled to Ohrdruf, alongside Generals Bradley and Patton, to see it for themselves. Eisenhower's reaction, recorded by multiple witnesses present that day, was a controlled but visible fury. The same kind of contained intensity he had shown weeks earlier on learning of the Rhine crossing, only now directed at something infinitely darker than wounded military pride. He gave direct orders that every American soldier in the vicinity who was not on the front line be marched through the camp to see it firsthand, reasoning that men needed to understand exactly what kind of enemy they had been fighting. He ordered that local German civilians from the nearby town be brought in to walk the grounds as well, so that no one could later claim ignorance of what had happened in their own backyard. And he insisted that photographers and newsreel crews document everything in exhaustive detail, telling those present that the world would someday be tempted to claim this had never happened, and that thorough evidence needed to exist to make denial impossible. For Patton, a man who had spent the entire campaign treating the war as something close to a personal contest of will and audacity, Ohrdruf landed differently. Multiple accounts from officers present describe him as visibly shaken, at one point stepping away from a section of the camp because, in his own words recorded afterward, he did not trust himself not to be physically sick. This was not theater. This was the same general who had joked about a full bladder on the bridge at Oppenheim, confronted with something that no amount of bravado could turn into an anecdote. The discovery at Ohrdruf reframed the entire final stretch of the campaign for the soldiers advancing through central Germany that spring. What had begun in the story's first chapter as an audacious tactical gamble to beat a rival general across a river had become, within a matter of weeks, part of something considerably larger, the dismantling of a regime responsible for atrocities the advancing troops were now seeing with their own eyes. The pace that had once been driven primarily by Patton's competitive instinct now carried a different kind of urgency. Every mile gained meant another camp potentially reached before its guards could finish covering their tracks. Another group of prisoners liberated before starvation or execution claimed them first. The advance did not slow down. If anything, it accelerated. American forces pushed through Bavaria over the following 2 weeks against resistance that grew more sporadic and disorganized with each passing day. On April 20, 1945, Hitler's 56th birthday elements of Patton's Third Army entered Nuremberg, the city that had hosted the Nazi Party's most elaborate pre-war rallies, the symbolic stage where Hitler had once addressed crowds of hundreds of thousands beneath enormous stone eagles and banners. Taking the city on that particular date was not lost on anyone involved. Soldiers who had crossed the Rhine in silence less than a month earlier were now standing in the very heart of Nazi political theater, watching German resistance in the area dissolve into scattered, disorganized surrender. The broader numbers from those final weeks remain staggering, even by the standards of a war that had already produced staggering numbers. Where the advance from Normandy to the Rhine had consumed 8 grinding months, the advance from the Rhine into the heart of Bavaria took less than 4 weeks. German prisoner counts across the central and southern sectors climbed into the hundreds of thousands as entire formations simply stopped fighting. Reports from forward American units described German soldiers actively seeking out American lines to surrender rather than risk capture by advancing Soviet forces approaching from the east, a fear that, given what was happening on the Eastern Front, was not irrational. Press coverage back in the United States, which had begun the month covering a daring river crossing as a story of military rivalry and headline competition, was now covering something with far greater moral weight: the systematic uncovering of the Holocaust's machinery, camp after camp, as American and Soviet forces converged from opposite directions on a regime entering its final collapse. For the engineers of the 249th Battalion, the soldiers whose names rarely appear in any history book, despite having built the bridge that started this entire chain of events, recognition came in smaller, quieter forms. Unit commendations, battle stars added to a service record, the kind of acknowledgement that exists in official paperwork rather than newspaper headlines, even as the bridge they built in 18 hours under enemy fire was later cited by military historians as a textbook example of combat engineering under pressure. A case study that would influence how American forces approached river crossing operations in conflicts decades later. Our young engineer from Ohio, like most of the men in his battalion, simply kept moving east with his unit through April, helping construct additional crossings and repair damaged roads as the front collapsed ahead of them, doing the unglamorous work that made every subsequent advance possible. The same work that rarely made it into the press releases Patton was so skilled at generating. By the final days of April, German resistance west of the Czechoslovak border had effectively ceased to exist as an organized force. Germany formally surrendered on May 7, 1945, less than 7 weeks after the first silent boat had touched the eastern bank of the Rhine near Oppenheim. The chain of events that closed out the European war, the collapse of the Central Front, the discovery of Ohrdruf, the symbolic capture of Nuremberg, the flood of surrendering divisions traced directly back to a decision made in the dark on the night of March 22nd by a general who had been told to wait his turn and decided not to. What remains after all of this is a question that the headlines, the medals, and even the photographs from Ohrdruf cannot fully answer. What happened to the man who set all of this in motion? The general whose audacity had reshaped the final 2 months of the war in Europe once the shooting finally stopped and the world no longer needed his particular brand of recklessness. And what became of the soldiers? Like our young engineer from Ohio, the men who built the bridges and crossed the rivers and witnessed things no press release would ever capture once they went home, and the war became something other people read about in history books. That story, the one that did not end with a surrender ceremony or a victory parade, is where this chapter closes and the final one begins. The journey began with a gamble nobody had authorized, a silent crossing in the dark on a stretch of riverbank the Germans never bothered to defend. It became a bridge built in 18 hours under enemy fire, a headline war between 2 generals who could not stand each other, and finally the collapse of an entire front. the liberation of a death camp, and a surrender less than 7 weeks later. We left the story with German resistance broken, Nuremberg taken, and the war in Europe effectively over. But the cliffhanger we left hanging was simpler than any of that. What happened to the man behind it all once the shooting stopped and the world stopped needing what he was so good at giving it? Because as it turns out, this story has one more twist, and it is not the kind of twist anyone walking onto that pontoon bridge in March of 1945 would have predicted. Success. It turns out, sometimes comes with a price nobody sees coming until it is already too late to pay any other way. For George Patton, the man whose name is forever attached to the Rhine crossing victory in Europe, did not bring the kind of ending his entire life seemed to be building toward. He had spent decades convinced he was destined for a singular defining moment of glory, and in many ways, the crossing at Oppenheim was exactly that moment. But peacetime did not suit him. Assigned to administrative duties in occupied Bavaria after Germany's surrender, Patton chafed almost immediately against a role that asked him to manage paperwork and political sensitivities rather than lead men into history. He made a series of public comments minimizing the difference between former Nazi Party members and ordinary German citizens that caused a serious controversy, and by October of 1945, he had been removed from command of the Third Army, the army he had built his entire legend around, and reassigned to a far less prominent post. The general who had outraced an entire field marshal across Hitler's last great river was in the final months of his life sidelined. Then on December 9, 1945, 7 months after the war in Europe ended, Patton was riding in his staff car toward a pheasant hunt near Mannheim when it collided with a U.S. Army truck at a road junction. The crash broke his neck. He was rushed to a military hospital in Heidelberg, where doctors told him he would likely never walk again, let alone ride a horse or return to any kind of active life. His reported response, in keeping with the man, was that this was a hell of a way to die. He held on for 12 days before a blood clot took his life on December 21, 1945, at age 60, paralyzed from the neck down. He was buried on Christmas Eve at the Luxembourg American Cemetery, deliberately placed among the soldiers of his own Third Army, who had fallen during the Battle of the Bulge, the men he had once turned an entire army 90 degrees in winter to save. He never got the long-celebrated retirement that men like Eisenhower and Montgomery would go on to have. He got 7 months a car accident and a grave among his soldiers. But the real story of Oppenheim was never really about generals, and that brings us back to the men who rarely make it into the history books at all. The soldiers of the 249th Engineer Combat Battalion, who built that bridge in 18 hours while German shells fell around them and German aircraft tried to burn the whole thing down before sunrise. Most of them went home in 1945, and 1946 returned to the same ordinary jobs and small towns they had left behind, and largely did not talk about what they had done. That is simply how most of this kind of history actually works. The generals write memoirs and give interviews. The engineers go back to fixing tractors and welding silos and raising families, and the bridge they built under fire becomes a single line in an official after-action report that almost nobody ever reads. It would take more than 70 years before that quiet sacrifice received any kind of public monument at all. But the true legacy of Oppenheim was never going to be a statue. It was a method, and that method outlived every man who carried a boat to the riverbank that night. The techniques refined by the 249th and the units that crossed alongside them, concurrent work teams, building bridge sections simultaneously rather than sequentially. Pre-positioning bridging equipment hidden inside ordinary supply convoys to deny enemy reconnaissance. Any warning, calculating bridge construction speed not as a fixed ceiling but as a baseline to be beaten, became doctrine. American combat engineers carried these lessons into Korea, where rapid river crossings under fire became a recurring feature of that conflict's mobile phases. They carried them into Vietnam, where engineer battalions building bridges under threat of ambush owed a direct conceptual debt to what had been worked out under shellfire near a German wine town in 1945. Even in more recent conflicts, the basic principle that Patton's planners had gambled the entire operation on that speed and concealment can sometimes achieve more than overwhelming firepower and months of preparation, remains a core part of how modern militaries think about river crossings, gap crossings, and rapid mobility operations more broadly. It is difficult to put a precise number on how many lives that doctrine ultimately saved across decades of subsequent conflicts, but military historians studying combat engineering consistently point back to Oppenheim and Nierstein as the moment the modern approach to opposed river crossings was effectively proven under the worst possible conditions and found to work. But the deeper lesson of this story was never really about pontoon bridges or river currents at all. It is a lesson about where good ideas actually come from and who institutions are willing to listen to. The plan that crossed the Rhine at Oppenheim succeeded specifically because Patton's staff and the field commanders beneath them were willing to throw out the accepted doctrine the moment circumstances suggested the doctrine no longer applied. Standard military thinking held that an opposed river crossing of this scale required weeks of preparation, overwhelming artillery total air superiority. That doctrine was not wrong. Montgomery proved it could work at a cost of nearly 7,000 casualties. But Patton understood something that doctrine alone could not teach him, that the rules exist to handle the common case, and that real judgment lies in recognizing the moment you are standing in the exception. He did not discard the rulebook out of arrogance. He understood it well enough to know precisely which parts of it could be safely set aside and when. This is not a uniquely military lesson. It echoes through nearly every major leap forward in history, the moment someone with enough understanding of the established system recognizes exactly where that system has stopped fitting reality. The same pattern shows up again and again across the broader history of the Second World War in the small, unglamorous innovations that rarely get their own headline but quietly reshaped entire campaigns. Whether it was the proximity fuse that made anti-aircraft fire dramatically more effective almost overnight, or the floating mulberry harbors towed across the English Channel to make the Normandy landings logistically possible without capturing a port first, or the codebreakers at Bletchley Park, who treated a mathematical puzzle as seriously as any battlefield and shortened the war by years in the process. None of those breakthroughs came from blind obedience to existing doctrine. All of them came from people willing to ask whether the rule in front of them still applied to the problem at hand. That question, asked at the right moment by the right person, is still exactly how meaningful change happens today. Whether in a military command tent, a corporate boardroom, or a small team trying to solve a problem everyone else has already declared impossible. And there is one last detail to this story that rarely makes it into the popular retelling. The kind of detail that only surfaces when you dig past the famous phone calls and the photograph on the bridge. The crossing at Oppenheim is remembered today, when it is remembered at all almost entirely through Patton's own theatrical flourishes, the telegram, the handful of German soil, the line about William the Conqueror. But the monument that actually stands at Nierstein today, dedicated in 2017, does not feature Patton's name in its central inscription at all. It names the 249th Engineer Combat Battalion, specifically the men who built the bridge, rather than the man who walked across it. At that 2017 ceremony stood Helen Patton, the general's own granddaughter, alongside Catherine Rommel, granddaughter of the German Field Marshal, Erwin Rommel, two descendants of opposing commanders standing together at the exact spot where the first American boat touched German soil 80 years after the men who lived through it had carried their boats down to the water in total silence. It is a quiet, almost understated way for history to settle its own accounts, placing the credit not with the general who got the headlines, but with the soldiers who actually got the boats across and the bridge built before anyone in Berlin knew what had happened. So here finally is the whole arc laid out plainly. A general told to wait his turn refused to wait. A battalion of combat engineers built an impossible bridge in 18 hours under direct enemy fire. And within 7 weeks, an empire that had stood defiant behind the Rhine for 2,000 years collapsed entirely. 34 casualties bought what 8 months of grinding combat through Normandy and the Siegfried Line could not a hole torn straight through the heart of the Third Reich's last great natural defense. Patton got 7 more months of life and a grave among his own soldiers. The engineers got their names on a granite plaque 7 decades later. And the lesson outlived every one of them, carried forward into Korea, into Vietnam, into the doctrine modern armies still study today, the simple, dangerous, occasionally brilliant idea that sometimes the fastest way through is the one nobody else is watching. History remembers the man who pissed in the Rhine. It should remember just as clearly the men who built the bridge that let him reach it.